For Manchester United, controversial ownership is nothing new. In the 1980s, they were subject to takeover attempts by Robert Maxwell and Michael Knighton, and in the early 2000s, they were even a brief object of interest for Colonel Gaddafi. But it's an attempted takeover from the late 1990s that's probably the most famous. This is the story of when Rupert Murdoch almost bought Manchester United. Long before the Glazer family, and before most Manchester United fans had heard the term leveraged buyout, their club was owned by the Edwards family. Lewis Edwards had purchased his shareholding and become a club director the day after the Munich air disaster, and he would become club chairman 7 years later in 1965, holding the position until 1980 when he died and his shares and role passed to his son Martin Edwards. The younger Edwards would remain as chief executive until 2000, and as chairman until his resignation in 2002. As Andy Mitten wrote in British GQ in 2017, Edwards Jr. inherited a commercially unsophisticated club, with an annual turnover of £2 million, a club where he discovered that the manager negotiated Manchester United's kit deal. His era created tremendous change, and not just some of the most successful seasons in the club's history, but any club in the game's history. And yet his tenure was complicated. Edwards had twice tried to sell part of his shareholding in the 80s, first to the notorious Maxwell in 84 and then to Knighton in 89. The response to Maxwell had been revulsion among the fans. And while Knighton was a wholly different character, the toe-curling memory of him juggling a football on the Old Trafford pitch while dressed in a United tracksuit is a source of embarrassment to this day. In 1991, Edwards floated the club on the stock exchange. As the decade wore on and United became incontestably the biggest club in the country, he began a pattern of highly lucrative share sales. Among others, in 1996, the Irish Times reported that he'd made around £10 million after selling 2.23 million shares. In 1997, another sale was claimed to have raised a further £3.9 million. Now, context is important. Manchester United of the 1990s were not a heavy spender, at least not in relative terms. They were constrained by a strict wage ceiling and at the time were unable to compete for some of the very best players in the game. In the summer of 1996, for instance, when Newcastle broke the world transfer record to sign Alan Shearer, United signed 5 players for £10 million combined, and their transfer record was still the £8 million spent on Andy Cole in the winter of '94. And this was a source of tremendous frustration among supporters, and in his own series of autobiographies, Alex Ferguson does little to disguise his own irritation with his club's board. In both cases, that hardly served to make Edwards a universally popular figure. The other great development in English football in the 1990s was, of course, the rise of television. Front and centre of that movement was Rupert Murdoch, whose News Corp owned 40% of Sky B. Sky had used football to sell its satellite dishes in the UK, betting successfully on the game's popularity and underwriting the Premier League's exponential rise with an increasingly decadent broadcasting contract. However, while the Premier League was founded on the premise that television revenue should be shared by its member clubs, the expectation within a few years of its launch was that the biggest clubs would eventually negotiate their own contracts. And that fear was partly driven by the growth of teams like Manchester United, and not without due cause. Prior to the story of Sky B's takeover breaking in the Sunday Telegraph in September 1998, United and Sky B had collaborated in the creation of MUTV, the club's in-house television channel. And the premise for the original meeting between the two parties, which led to the attempted takeover that took place in July of 1998, was a conversation about pay-per-view matches in British football. United weren't the only club who were minded that way, and they weren't even the first to launch their own television channel, but it was representative of a growing trend, and most observers agreed, the future. Television companies owning shares in football companies wasn't new either, and Sky B weren't alone in their ambition. In the years prior and in those that would follow, Granada Television, which would later become ITV, held shares in Arsenal and Liverpool. And NTL, a now defunct satellite provider, owned holdings in Newcastle, Middlesbrough and Aston Villa. But United and Sky was a different matter. When it was announced that a £623 million deal had been agreed, the hostility and opposition was almost instant. Rival clubs and fans naturally feared an irreversible slanting to the league's competitive balance. But United's own supporters quickly mobilised too, and anti-Murdoch and anti-Sky t-shirts became a fixture at United games as autumn turned to winter in 1998. In an anecdote which captures how strong the mood was, in an article for 442 magazine, Gary Parkinson describes one fan group, the Independent Manchester United Supporters Association, receiving a £10,000 donation from Queen drummer Roger Taylor. And away from the fans, the media also had their concerns, with fears over preferential access for the Murdoch-owned titles, The Sun and The Times, and denial of access in British football. The then editor of The Mirror, Piers Morgan, who famously mocked up Rupert Murdoch as a devil on his front page in response to the takeover story, was also the architect of one of the saga's more absurd moments. Ahead of a news conference featuring B-Sky B CEO Mark Booth, Morgan instructed one of his journalists to quiz the American and ask him to name Manchester United's starting left-back. Booth floundered uncomfortably. The press auditorium rocked with mocking laughter, and somewhere Dennis Irwin was presumably quite offended. But the takeover had bigger problems: the British government. One of the stranger details, which was recalled by The Athletic's Adam Crafton in March 2020, was that United manager Alex Ferguson first heard news of the takeover via a voicemail from Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's secretary of the time. It's strange, but somehow still true. It was especially complicated for Blair, because his new Labour had risen to power partly through the patronage of the Murdoch-owned media titles and was now being pressured to intervene. And, following examination by the Office of Fair Trade, the takeover was referred to the Monopoly and Mergers Commission for review. Then, in March 1999, after a 4-month investigation, it was announced by Stephen Byers, Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, that the deal was being blocked on the basis that it was anti-competition. It would damage the quality of British football by reinforcing the trend towards growing inequalities between the larger, richer clubs and the smaller, poorer ones, read the report, which Martin Edwards would later say could not have been more damaging. Several Murdoch papers ran damning editorials in response. Mark Booth, the B-Sky B CEO, was also scathing of the decision. "This is a bad ruling for British football clubs," he responded, "as teams will have to compete in Europe against clubs who are backed by successful media companies." And yet he was wrong, wrote Adam Crafton in his piece for The Athletic. English clubs would find alternative investment in abundance, while United's value continued to skyrocket. It was a classic sliding doors moment in English football. And yet, interestingly, it also came at a point before the game could contemplate the scale of resources that the next generation of owners would make available. For United specifically, however, it would hardly be the last time that ownership would be a pressing and pertinent topic. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you do enjoy Tifo, then you'll probably also like The Athletic. If you watch our tactics videos, you should go and read Michael Cox. If you're into data, read Mark Carey. And if you're into transfers, it's David Ornstein. Plus, if you're a fan of any Premier League team, then there's a journalist dedicated to you, and you can try it for free for 30 days now by clicking the link in the description.